Welcome to a real cult classic, Intermission with Megs. For this week's episode, I have combined all the Marilyn videos into one. Go grab your popcorn, hit the restroom, and stretch your legs because this is Intermission with Megs. Norma Jean Mortensen was born on June 1st, 1926 in Los Angeles, California. Her mother Gladys had two marriages under her belt before having Marilyn. The first was to Jasper Baker just 10 days before her 15th birthday, with her mother's permission, of course. They had two fetal collaborations, and Jasper beat the snot out of her, so Gladys filed for divorce and won custody of both children. Jasper kidnapped the children and took them to Kentucky. Gladys relocated to Kentucky to try and get her children back, but Jasper had remarried and no one would help her. She started to drink quite heavily after she lost her kids. Then she met Martin Mortensen, and the two were married on October 11th, 1924, only a few months after meeting. But Gladys got bored and left him. He filed for divorce in May of 1925, citing desertion. Which is so interesting. While Gladys was working at RKO, she had a dalliance with her superior, Charles Stanley Gifford. She found herself pregnant with Marilyn, baby Norma Jean, in late 1925, but Chuck's family wasn't down with him marrying a pregnant woman who had other children she wasn't raising. After she had Marilyn, Gladys wouldn't allow Chuck to visit and gave Marilyn the last name of Mortensen as she was still legally married to Martin. Their divorce wouldn't be finalized until 1928. Meanwhile, Marilyn had been told that her father was dead. Well, it may have said Mortensen on her birth certificate, Gladys' mother, Della, had the baby baptized as Baker to try to hide the fact that she was an illegitimate fetal collaboration. Marilyn's childhood was, to put it kindly, an absolute mess. Gladys suffered from postpartum depression and would leave her daughter with a neighboring family while she worked. She saw Norma Jean so little that she referred to her mother as the woman with the red hair. Gladys eventually bought a home to share with Marilyn, but in 1934 she was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and would spend the rest of her life in and out of hospitals. Marilyn became a ward of the state and ended up in and out of the orphanage, as well as 11 foster homes. There are reports that Marilyn was abused under the care of various foster families. It was in 1941 when 20-year-old James Doherty, who had been working nights at Lockheed Aircraft as the war ramped up, got a strange phone call from his neighbor, Grace Goddard. Grace had been taking care of 15-year-old Marilyn. Her family wanted to leave Los Angeles and move back to West Virginia due to Grace's husband, Doc's job, but they couldn't take the teenager with them due to child protection laws that wouldn't allow them to take her out of state. They didn't want her to end up back in the orphanage or at another foster home, so Grace suggested an alternative. Maybe James would marry her. And if you're thinking, Megan, that's absurd. Yes, it was. Especially since Grace had already sent the teen back to the orphanage multiple times previously. Not to mention the fact that one of those families that allegedly abused Marilyn was the Goddards, specifically Doc, who had apparently got grabby one night with Marilyn when he had been out drinking. Regardless, James took the teen out to a dance, and surprisingly, they got along pretty well. They ended up falling in love, and a few months later, on June 19th, 1942, James married Norma Jean Baker. She had just turned 16 years old. James would end up joining the U.S. Merchant Marines while Norma Jean dropped out of school and took care of the house. James appreciated his feisty and funny wife. He said he was the luckiest guy in the world. The marriage started in a studio apartment in Sherman Oaks, but eventually James's career would take them to Catalina Island, where they would spend time on the beach and enjoy newlywed life. The young couple dreamed of owning a big house and filling it with kids, but in 1944, that dream was put on hold when James was sent overseas and Norma Jean took on a job at the radio plane company in Van Nuys to help contribute to the war effort. It was at the factory that she would catch the eye of photographer David Conover, who was taking photos of women involved in the war effort. He said that Norma Jean was a real morale booster and took her picture for the boys in the army to keep their morale high. She continued modeling for David and his friends, eventually quitting work at the factory, moving out on her own, and signing with the Blue Book Model Agency, all against James' wishes. Under advisement from the modeling agency, she straightened her brown hair and dyed it platinum blonde. She worked hard, gracing the covers of 33 magazines over the course of 1946. Her modeling agency led her to signing a contract with an acting agency in the summer of 1946. She screen tested with Paramount Pictures, which was unsuccessful, and then with 20th Century Fox. They were also unenthused but signed the 20-year-old model in an effort to keep her away from their rival RKO Pictures. 20th Century Fox exec Ben Lyon told her that Doherty could be pronounced too many ways and suggested a name change. He suggested Marilyn after Broadway star Marilyn Miller, who Norma Jean reminded him of. She picked Monroe since it was her mother's maiden name, and she felt like that was more her own than anything. Marilyn sealed Norma Jean Doherty's fate when she had James served with divorce papers while he was on a ship in the Yangtze River. James claimed that the studio pressured Marilyn into the divorce, that they didn't want a pregnant starlet. He tried to change her mind, but she wouldn't budge. Their divorce was finalized in September of 1946. Marilyn, on the other hand, told a different tale, one of boredom and indifference. She said that her marriage didn't make her sad, but didn't make her happy either. She said, "My husband and I hardly spoke to each other. This wasn't because we were angry. We had nothing to say. I was dying of boredom." Although it's alleged that both her modeling agency and 20th Century Fox did stipulate that she had to be unmarried. James would go on to remarry in 1947. He and his wife Patricia had 3 daughters. Patricia was a little jealous of his first marriage, and out of respect for her, he didn't see any of Marilyn's films and burned all of her letters. In 1949, he joined the LAPD and would eventually become a detective. He apparently broke up a scheme to kidnap actor James Garner. He played Duke or Elder Noah Calhoun in The Notebook. Patricia and James would divorce, and he would marry for the 3rd time in 1974. He and his wife Rita moved to Maine, where he taught at the Criminal Justice Academy and worked as a county commissioner. Since Rita wasn't as bothered with his marriage to Marilyn, James started to talk about their time together more, even releasing 2 memoirs, The Secret Happiness of Marilyn Monroe and To Norma Jean with Love, Jimmy. Rita sadly passed away in 2003, and in 2004, Marilyn's Man, a documentary about James, premiered. James passed away in 2005 at the age of 84 due to complications from leukemia. The LA Times, Chicago Tribune, and the New York Times all printed his obituary. Even though Rita let James feel more comfortable speaking about his time with Marilyn, he said, "I never knew Marilyn Monroe, and I don't claim to have any insights to her to this day. I knew and loved Norma Jean." In 1951, famous retired baseball player Joe DiMaggio saw a photo of Marilyn Monroe, the blonde bombshell herself, holding a baseball bat, and he decided that he wanted to meet the star. Joseph Paul DiMaggio was a star in his own right, though. He hit 361 home runs over the course of his career and helped take the Yankees to the championship during his rookie year. He was praised for how easy he made the game look, how graceful he was on the field, but that grace didn't transfer to his private life, where he was said to be shy and guarded. Despite his awkwardness, he managed to land actress Dorothy Arnold. The pair were married in November of 1939 in San Francisco. 20,000 fans flooded the streets in hopes to catch a glimpse of the newlyweds. They would have one fetal collaboration, Joe Jr., but then 4 years after they wed, Dorothy filed for divorce, saying, "We had a home, but Joe was never there." He had expected Dorothy to give up her career in favor of his. It was said that he managed to be both inattentive yet jealous all at the same time. She had initially left him during the 1942 season, but the Yankees begged her to return, and she did, only to file for divorce at the end of the season. Many thought Joe wanted to save the marriage to avoid the draft, but then he had to enlist so that they wouldn't call him a coward. Dorothy served him with papers while he was enlisted, calling him cruel and indifferent. Joe thought they'd reconcile, never giving up hope. That is, until he saw that photo of Marilyn Monroe. He asked a friend to introduce him to the starlet. Marilyn was reluctant. She thought the retired Yankee would be just another arrogant athlete. The two ended up hitting it off after their blind date, although I'm not sure how blind it really was, and entered into a long-distance relationship with Joe living on the East Coast and Marilyn on the West. They would date for 2 years and attempted to keep their relationship private, but these things always get out. The media loved their story, calling them one of America's ultimate romantic fantasies. Marilyn and Joe found commonality in their humble beginnings, with Joe, the son of Sicilian immigrants, becoming a famous baseball player, and Marilyn, a kid who bounced around between foster homes and orphanages, becoming a Hollywood starlet. They both also wanted children, despite Marilyn's struggle with endometriosis. Being with Marilyn also helped bolster Joe's image after his retirement, while Joe gave Marilyn an air of respectability, whatever the heck that means. On January 14th, 1954, 27-year-old Marilyn and 39-year-old Joe were married at San Francisco City Hall. History seems to repeat itself with Joe. Fans waited eagerly outside to see the newlyweds. The pair opted for an elopement as it was the second marriage for both, and the church wasn't really down for that. They flew to Japan, where they would honeymoon in Tokyo, but the honeymoon phase did not last when Marilyn was called to South Korea to entertain the troops to help boost morale during the Korean War. Joe already took issue with the level of attention she got. He hated the cameras, but he did love the fame. It was often a tense subject between the two. Marilyn had recounted a conversation that they had had early on when Joe wondered if he could take all her crazy publicity. "You don't have to be a part of it," she argued. "I am," he said, "and it bothers me." "It's part of my career," Marilyn said. "When you were a baseball idol, you didn't duck photographers." "Yes, I did," he answered. "I can't," she said. "Don't I know it?" Joe nodded. It wasn't surprising that he was not happy about her going to Korea, and the two had a blowout fight. Joe's jealousy was only exacerbated by Marilyn's bombshell image, and he could be very controlling when it came to her hectic schedule. It would all come to a head when Marilyn filmed that iconic flying skirt scene for the 7-year itch. Fans and paparazzi were on scene cheering Marilyn on. Joe was so furious that he took his anger out on everyone that was around, but Marilyn bore the brunt of it behind closed doors. The following day, Marilyn had bruising on her arms, leading to speculation that Joe had hit her. A month later, Marilyn filed for divorce, citing mental cruelty. They'd only been married for 9 months. Although their marriage was rocky, their affection for one another was undeniable. Marilyn cried at her divorce announcement and throughout the proceedings. Joe was devastated and begged Marilyn for a second chance. After the dissolution of their marriage, Joe attended therapy, stopped drinking, and sought out interests outside of baseball. While he was connected to quite the lineup of ladies, including 1957's Miss America, Marion Knight, and Marlene Dietrich, he would never remarry. In 1955, Joe was inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame, and in 1968, Paul Simon wrote to Mrs. Robinson with the iconic line, "Where have you gone, Joe DiMaggio? A nation turns its lonely eyes to you." Which confused everyone, including Joe DiMaggio. Simon, a huge Yankees fan, would find himself face to face with Joe, never expecting that he'd have to explain himself. "Why'd you say that? I'm here. Everyone knows I'm here," Joe said. Paul responded with, "I don't mean it that way. I mean, where are these great heroes now?" Joe was more flattered than confused after that. In 1992, the Joe DiMaggio Children's Hospital at Memorial Regional Hospital in Hollywood, Florida, opened its doors. Joe helped raise over $4 million for it. But we'll talk more about Joe later. The first time Arthur Miller met Marilyn Monroe was in 1951 when the pair were introduced by his friend Elia Kazan. Arthur was one of the country's most prominent playwrights. He had just won a Pulitzer for his play Death of a Salesman. Marilyn's career was just starting to take off. Arthur was married to Mary Slattery. The two had married after graduating from the University of Michigan. Mary had given Arthur 2 fetal collaborations and had supported him financially while he tried to build a career as a playwright. While Marilyn would go on to marry Joe DiMaggio, she would keep in touch with Arthur, writing letters back and forth. After her divorce, she moved to New York to study acting in 1955, and it was then that she started an affair with the still married Arthur Miller. He was reluctant to leave his wife, but he was also deeply in love with Marilyn, so he moved to Arizona to establish residency and divorced his wife. While in Nevada, he applied for a passport so he could travel to England with Marilyn. His application earned him a subpoena to appear before the House of Un-American Activities Committee to testify about his ties to communism. America was deep into its second Red Scare, Senator Joseph McCarthy's hunt for those evil communists. Arthur's 1953 play, The Crucible, raise your hand if you were forced to read it in school, was about the Salem witch trials, but was actually an allegory for McCarthyism. This obviously placed a target on the playwright's back. He refused to name names and was threatened with a contempt citation from Congress. But you know who did name names? His old friend Ilya Kazan. He received a Special Lifetime Achievement Oscar in 1999, and half the audience refused to stand for the standing ovation, and many wouldn't even clap. Ed Harris looked especially annoyed. Marilyn was warned by her studio to distance herself from Arthur, but she didn't. In fact, she did the very opposite, showing up for him at his hearings and speaking up in support of her boyfriend. Arthur was cited for contempt. The charge would eventually be overturned on appeal, but they still gave him a passport so he could visit old Blighty. Marilyn and Arthur would be married in a 4-minute-long civil ceremony on June 29, 1956, in a judge's office in White Plains, New York. Marilyn was 29 and Arthur was 40. They would have a larger Jewish ceremony on July 1st, an event that she had converted to Judaism for. She had also said that converting made her feel closer to Arthur's family since she didn't have a family of her own. Shortly after they were married, Marilyn was quoted as saying, "This is the first time I've been really in love." Meanwhile, Arthur was telling reporters that Marilyn would only make one film every 18 months, and during her time off, she would be his wife. That was her full-time job. After the wedding, the pair traveled to England, where Marilyn was set to shoot The Prince and the Showgirl with Laurence Olivier. It would be the one and only film made under her production company, Marilyn Monroe Productions. Unfortunately, she had a miserable time, and she and Laurence clashed. On top of her issues with Laurence, she found notes that Arthur had been making about her, detailing how he sometimes found her embarrassing and that he was disappointed in their marriage. Marilyn had told her acting coach, Paula Strasberg, and her husband, Lee, about it, how he thought I was some kind of angel, but now he guessed he was wrong, that his first wife had let him down, but I had done something worse. Oh yeah, that Mary sure was a letdown. She only funded Arthur's very existence, which allowed him to win a Pulitzer, and then he cheated on her. Marilyn tried to be the wife Arthur wanted. She tried to be a homemaker and a mother, but the couple had difficulty conceiving. She suffered an ectopic pregnancy and multiple miscarriages, including one during the filming of Some Like It Hot. Prior to their marriage, Marilyn had been treating her anxiety with drugs, and the struggles with her marriage and fame only furthered her addiction. This resulted in her hospitalization from a barbiturate overdose in 1957. She blamed herself for the fact that she could not give Arthur a child, believing that her pill and alcohol use had resulted in her miscarriage during Some Like It Hot, when in reality, her inability to maintain a pregnancy had a lot to do with her endometriosis. It also contributed a lot to her pain, which led to her taking more pain medication. Not to mention the fact that she was using medication to cope with her depression from the losses she had suffered. All she wanted was a family. All she wanted was to be a mother. In 1960, Marilyn would star alongside French actor Yves Montand in Let's Make Love. His casting was suggested to the director by none other than Arthur Miller. Arthur had also been involved in rewrites of the script, which caused Gregory Peck to leave as his part was lessened in favor of more screen time for Marilyn. Marilyn wasn't too happy with Arthur either, as she felt his rewrites for her were lackluster. It was during filming that Marilyn and Eve decided to take the title of the movie seriously and started an affair, meeting up regularly at the Beverly Hills Hotel. Marilyn knew where her marriage stood when Arthur didn't object to the affair or bother fighting for his wife. Then they filmed The Misfits together. Based on a short story by Arthur, The Misfits was supposed to help Marilyn be taken seriously as an actress. But with Arthur's constant rewrites and Marilyn's continuing addiction to pills and alcohol, she struggled throughout filming, saying, "Arthur said it's his movie. I don't think he even wants me in it. It's all over. We have to stay with each other because it would be bad for the film if we split up now." She would end up hospitalized for a week during filming. After being released, she would complete the picture, but her marriage to Arthur was over. They announced their plans to divorce on November 11th, 1960, and went to Mexico to obtain their divorce in January of 1961, a time chosen due to it also being JFK's inauguration. They hoped all eyes would be on the 35th president instead, and we sure know that they would be. Arthur would go on to write After the Fall, a play that was highly criticized for Arthur's perceived exploitation of Marilyn and his attempt to cash in on her fame. These accusations made him angry. He claimed it was not about Marilyn at all. He would go on to marry photographer Inga Morath, who had worked on the set of The Misfits. The pair would have two fetal collaborations, Rebecca and Daniel. Daniel was born with Down syndrome, and Arthur had him institutionalized against his wife's wishes, although he most likely would have had the support from doctors at the time. Inga would visit Daniel often, but Arthur rarely visited him and refused to acknowledge Daniel's existence publicly. Daniel would end up at Southbury Training School, an institution that would be sued by the U.S. Department of Justice for its mistreatment of residents. Others visited Daniel, including Arthur's son-in-law, Rebecca's husband, Daniel Day-Lewis. Yes, the Daniel Day-Lewis. He even encouraged Arthur to have some part in his son's life in the 90s. And no, Daniel did not get his role in The Crucible due to nepotism. He would actually meet Rebecca on the set of that movie. Daniel Day did have influence over his father-in-law, though. Arthur joined one of Daniel's annual overall plan of service reviews, which was held at his son's apartment. Arthur was blown away with how well Daniel was doing and the fact that he was able to successfully live on his own. He said, "I would never have dreamed this for my son. If you would have told me when he first started out that he would get to this point, I would have never believed it." But that would be the one and only meeting he would ever attend. Arthur and Inga remained together until her passing in 2002 from lymphoma. In 2004, 88-year-old Arthur told journalists that he was in love with 34-year-old painter Agnes Barley and that the two had been living together at his Connecticut farm since 2002. The pair had met several months after Inga's passing, allegedly. They said that they planned to be married. But then on February 10th, 2005, Arthur passed away from bladder cancer and heart failure at his home with Agnes by his side. He was 89 years old. Allegedly, Rebecca, who had not been a fan of her father's relationship, told Agnes she had until the end of the week to get the heck out of the house. 2 years after Arthur's passing, his son Daniel was revealed to the public in an article in Vanity Fair titled Arthur Miller's Missing Act. I highly recommend reading it as it reveals many things about Arthur and his relationship with his son, like the fact that he was not in attendance at his father's funeral, nor was he mentioned in any of his obituaries, and only received funding from his father after his death. Not only did Arthur wait to make any type of contribution to Daniel until after his passing, but he didn't will it properly, and the state ended up seeking repayment for all of the financial support Daniel had while under state care when he was a minor. Good job, Arthur. But enough about that knob, Arthur Miller. Let's get back to Marilyn. In 1961, after divorcing Arthur, Marilyn and Joe rekindled their friendship. He was there after she had surgery for her endometriosis and after an emergency surgery to remove her gallbladder. He was also there when she was hospitalized after a nervous breakdown and was the one she called to get her out. He even whisked her away to Florida for Yankees training camp so she could get some rest. Marilyn and Joe had reunited in friendship. They would read poetry together and just hang out. She had also started dating Frank Sinatra. She called him Frankie, he called her Norma Jean. The pair had even planned to be married, but after a night of watching Marilyn chase pills with a bottle of Dom, as in Perrier, Frankie put those plans on hold as he thought she was too messy. The two would remain friends with benefits. Guess she wasn't so messy that he had to stop sleeping with her. In 1962, Marilyn moved back to California permanently, purchasing her first and only home at 12305 Fifth Helena Drive in Brentwood, California. That spring, she started filming Something's Gotta Give with Dean Martin, but from the very first day of production, it was rife with issues due to Marilyn. First, there was the sinusitis, which postponed her scenes for a month. When she was finally able to return to set, she filmed a nude pool scene in nothing but nude bottoms, something no actress had ever done before. On June 1st, 1962, her 36th birthday, the crew had gotten her a cake and a card, but the director wouldn't let them celebrate until he had gotten a full day of work out of her. That night, she went to a muscular dystrophy fundraiser at Dodger Stadium with Joe, as well as Dean Martin's son. The following Monday, she called in sick. Her sinusitis had flared up. Production had had enough. She was officially fired on June 8th. One of the deciding factors of her firing was the fact that the studio was already under financial pressure from a little production called Cleopatra. It always comes back to Elizabeth Taylor, doesn't it? Dean refused to carry on with the movie without Marilyn, and so the studio hired her back, agreeing to pay her even more than before, but she had to sign on for another film. Filming was set to resume that October, but as you might already know, that would never happen. While Marilyn was off filming for a month with sinusitis, she still managed to make her way to Madison Square Garden on May 19th, 1962, to celebrate President John F. Kennedy's birthday. She wore that iconic rhinestone dress that was recently destroyed, well done, Ripley's, and sang her breathy rendition of Happy Birthday.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, Mr. President. Happy birthday to you.
But why would Marilyn compromise her reputation on set by attending the president's birthday? Because they were sleeping together, of course. Most biographers believe the affair began that March at Bing Crosby's Palm Springs house. It was that weekend that he allegedly asked her to perform at his birthday celebration. While some believe the affair persisted, others claim it was only that weekend, that it wasn't a major event for either. Marilyn just liked the secrecy and drama of it all, but did not intend to make a life with JFK. It has long been speculated that he wasn't the only Kennedy she shared a bed with. JFK's little brother Robert, also known as Bobby, was allegedly spending some quality time with the starlet as well. It was also rumored that around this time, Joe asked Marilyn to marry him again in an attempt to protect her. From the Kennedys? Maybe. But the most dangerous person in Marilyn's life might have very well been herself. In the wee hours of the morning on August 5th, 1962, Marilyn's housekeeper, Eunice Murray, woke up feeling something was amiss. She'd been asked to stay over by Marilyn's psychiatrist, Ralph Greenson. Marilyn had been highly emotional earlier that day. Ralph's words. Ralph left at 7 p.m. and Marilyn had headed into her room with her phone. Actor Peter Lawford said that he spoke to Marilyn around 7:30 p.m. and that she sounded depressed and that her speech was slurred. He claimed she said, "Say goodbye to the president and say goodbye to yourself because you're a nice guy." But Joe DiMaggio Jr., who had remained close with his stepmother, said that he called her at 7:30 p.m. to tell her he was breaking off his engagement with a girl Marilyn hadn't approved of. He said she was in very good spirits when she heard the news. When Eunice saw a light on under the door, she called Ralph around 3:30 a.m. Ralph peered into Marilyn's bedroom through her window and saw her nude body on the bed. He broke in through the window and called Marilyn's doctor. Apparently, the window had been fixed by the time police arrived. Police were finally called around 4:25 a.m. When they arrived, they found the starlet deceased on her bed from an apparent overdose of 47 Nembutal pills. Yet, when she was autopsied, there was no trace of the pills in her stomach or that she had taken the pills orally at all. Not only that, but one LAPD officer said that her body looked posed. Her legs were stretched out perfectly straight, unlike the contorted bodies of those he had seen pass from previous overdoses. Oh, and there was a bunch of evidence missing. Regardless, her death was ruled a probable suicide. Was she just a washed-up actress who took her own life, or was something more sinister at play? It turned out that Eunice had been fired earlier that month, and August 4th was her last day. 20 years later, she admitted that Bobby Kennedy had been at the house earlier that day after he had denied being in LA at all. She also said that an ambulance had arrived while Marilyn was still alive. Marilyn's hairdresser had said that Bobby had been at Marilyn's house earlier that day with Peter Lawford and had been threatening the actress. JFK wanted to run for another term, and his wife Jackie wanted Marilyn gone. Or maybe it was the FBI who had been keeping tabs on Marilyn during her marriage to Arthur Miller. Actress Veronica Hamill bought Marilyn's house in 1972 and did claim to have found an extensive network of wiretaps. The conspiracies around her death are aplenty, including the rumor that her body went missing for several hours after her death. What actually happened to Marilyn? We'll most likely never know. But what we do know is that her funeral took place on August 8th, 1962 at the Westwood Village Memorial Park Cemetery. Jo, Marilyn's half-sister Bernice, and her business manager Inez Milson planned the funeral together. I know some people were bothered by Marilyn being laid to rest in a Christian cemetery, but Memorial Park is non-denominational, and Marilyn also referred to herself as a Jewish atheist, who was seemingly more aligned with the culture than the religious beliefs. She did request to have Judy Garland's Somewhere Over the Rainbow played, so I do think that if she had requested a Jewish ceremony, Jo would have honored that. He also kept the guest list tight, keeping out the Hollywood execs and her close friends, and Arthur didn't attend, saying, "She won't be there." Marilyn was laid to rest in Crypt 24 in the Corridor of Memories. There was a bidding war for the spots around her. Hugh Hefner won one of those spots. He had never met the actress, but had purchased her nude photos when she was a struggling actress and had used them in his magazine without her consent. He was laid to rest next to her upon his passing in 2017. There's also allegedly a man in the crypt above her who was buried face down, telling his widow that he would haunt her forever if she didn't bury him face down over Marilyn. He got his way for 23 years, and his widow must have stopped caring about the haunting because in 2009 she put his plot up for auction on eBay so she could pay off her mortgage. She apparently sold it for $4.6 million and intended on moving him one spot over to the crypt Jo was supposed to go in. Jo had sold the two burial plots to that little creep after his divorce from Marilyn. From the day she was born, Norma Jean Baker deserved better. She deserved better from her mother and from the men in her life. Jo would seemingly spend his final years trying to repay Marilyn for the unkindness he had shown her throughout their marriage by showing up for her both after the divorce and after her death. He had fresh roses delivered to her grave twice a week for 20 years. A heavy smoker for much of his life, Jo was admitted to the hospital on October 12th, 1998 for lung cancer surgery. He was there for 99 days before being released. He passed away in his home in Hollywood, Florida on March 8th, 1999. He was 84 years old. His last words were reportedly, "I'll finally get to see Marilyn." Over the course of her 36 short years on this earth, Marilyn appeared in 29 films and was inducted into the Hollywood Hall of Fame in 1960. In 1999, the American Film Institute ranked her the sixth greatest film actress. She was nominated for 2 BAFTAs and 2 Golden Globes, one of which she won for Some Like It Hot. She never got an Oscar, though. Nor did she ever get to have the children that she so desperately wanted. At one point, she had her appendix taken out, and she had left a note on her stomach that told the doctor explicitly, "Do not take my ovaries." That is how badly she wanted to have a child. She was a woman well ahead of her time. She advocated for women's reproductive health care as well as equal pay. She even walked off the set of Girl in Pink Tights when she found out good old Frankie would be making 3 times her salary. It earned her a suspension that she treated like a vacation. Ah, Marilyn. She leveraged her marriage to Joe DiMaggio by tipping off photographers ahead of her nuptials, thus proving how much the media needed her. That got her out of Girl in Pink Tights, and a new deal with the 7-year Itch also earned her a bonus. Not to mention, years before the Me Too movement, she co authored an article titled Wolves I Have Known about predatory men in Hollywood who were running casting couches. She didn't name names, but the fact that she could said a lot. When I think of Marilyn, I don't see a victim. I see an incredibly strong woman who kept fighting despite the way that she had been treated her entire life. I see a woman who made the best of some of the worst situations and used them to her advantage, always propelling herself forward even when life was trying to drag her back down. When I look at Marilyn Monroe, I see someone who recognized when they were in bad situations and got themselves out. It's heartbreaking to think that in the end, there were some situations she would never make it out of alive. Well, that's it. That's all I have for you today. I hope you have a great weekend and. Oh, looks like it's time for you to get back to your seat.